Can transdisciplinary teaching be taught?
I think
How?
you can.
Yes, let's be optimistic then. Thank you. Oh, another
I
question,
think
sorry.
we are in continuity, and I'm happy that there is this kind of connection that is so beautiful, because you have asked some questions, and somehow, mysteriously, we have found a solution.
By practicing.
Kilometers, I think.
Yes, but with special people,
Yeah,
with dedicated teachers, and I was speaking just about the public system of education, which in my opinion is manipulating, positive or negative, but it's manipulating. The solution, in my opinion, will be not teaching, but monitoring, individual teaching, like in Asian Week.
Yeah, I agree, and I definitely share your views. But again, stories show us the way.
Yes, good
Just
view.
like many other presenters here told us meaningful stories, and if we look there, we see that there is always a structure showing us the way out. But we're not. We need to find a solution outside the system. Obviously, the solution is
Obviously, but
here.
still remains an individual attempt.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I have to add that Mirella Reshan is already, say, an historical figure of the movement of transdisciplinarity in Romania. In predation education is a very important college, Moise Nicoar, in Arad, where she made a lot of experiences, and now she's helped from some time by my bright PhD student. The first time I had Anka Muska is here and is a very happy construction here. Before giving the floor to Sacha, Kagan, our great His Excellency Emil Corizanu, the ambassador of Romania in Romania, is here, just arrived from Berlin. So, we'll continue with invited talk of Sacha Kagan, who is research associate at Leuphana University in Nuremberg, in Germany, and is one of the most the brightest and known researchers on the connection between arts and humanity. I'm very happy that he is here. After complication, he's an hero of this meeting. Hamburg airport was closed because electricity was cut down. He made incredible travels to arrive here. Okay.
I need to be moving so I stay awake. We've been, eating, and it's afternoon and quite warm, so if you need to move a little bit, as long as you're not too noisy, just to keep awake, don't hesitate in the next minute. So I will be talking about artful sustainability in transdisciplinary spaces of possibilities. And I will try to go through 3 moments, if I manage to keep the time, or to manage in time. First, about learning transdisciplinarily. Secondly, about becoming transdisciplinarily. And thirdly, about doing transdisciplinarily in the practices that have to do with either art-based research, with artful ways of living, and with artful approaches in social practices. So first of all, I start with learning. Learning we also hear the technique, if I move a bit. Learning transdisciplinarily. Here I'm interested in talking about the contributions that can be made to a transdisciplinary hermeneutics, whereby a dynamic and a complex relation between different ways of knowing and making worlds may be developed. First, a few words about the aesthetics of qualitative complexity, which I think are a very interesting aspect in this, in the contributions of artistic research and art-based research. What I find interesting in aesthetics of qualitative complexity is that they can be helpful in this process of going, of trying to fight against those different forms of reductionism. Nicolas talked about that, for example, from modernity to postmodernity. I recently was thinking of this notion that comes from queer theory, with this notion of a cisgender. And I was thinking maybe there's also a problem, not just of a kind of cisgender attitude in terms of gender studies, but also a problem of cisdisciplinary attitudes in terms of how we relate to disciplines. So attitudes to research where one may make the mistakes of being, let's say, content with situated, partly valid knowledges and learnings, which are of course made possible by disciplines, but which are, of course, mistaken when they take themselves for self-sufficient accesses to knowledge, or when one is merely satisfied with fragmentary learning. So this, I think, at least that's what I was thinking, maybe one can call that a cisdisciplinary attitude. A bit like, you know, metaphorically, when you think about a cisgender, this kind of self-identification and this kind of regulation that comes from there. I think that aesthetics of complexity can help to try to move away from that. When I say aesthetics of qualitative complexity, I just mentioned it shortly. I'm referring heavily to the work also of Edgar Morin and this idea of qualitatively complex relations, which means that all complex relations involve different relations in relation to each other, meaning in one of the formulations, which helpfully are a little bit simplified from Morin, is talking about having relations of complementarity, at the same time relations of competition, relations of unity, and relations of antagonism, and then also the relations between these relations. I think that certain forms of aesthetic experience can help us have an access to those forms of qualitative complexity. What it also means is finding a balance between also between dialogic processes and dialectic processes. In a dialectic process, in a Hegelian sense, the tensions between the opposing views are resolved through compromises or argumentative resolutions and synthesis. In a dialogic process, in the Bakhtinian sense, different views coexist and respect each other's difference, whereby oppositions remain open and unresolved. The challenge of a qualitatively complex approach is not to privilege dialectic or dialogic processes, for example, privileging the dialogic, as some proponents of mindfulness may argue, or I'm getting out of range of the technology, or vice versa, as some proponents of agonistics, for example, may argue. But instead to find a kind of dynamic process, negotiating, but that involves both dialectic and especially dialogic approaches in the Bakhtinian sense, which in a way is kind of what Morin also talks about when he talks about dialogics in a different way. So doing that through arts-based research means not trying to eliminate antagonisms, not trying to solve paradoxes, but trying to think through them. So what's interesting in the arts, in contributing to those approaches, is the idea of art as a form of question-based learning, where art allows to make research questions more interesting. It's about enabling questions that enable, and also ennobling questions that ennoble approaches and issues, that highlight those qualitatively complex relations, that highlight indeterminacy, rather than an approach which is very interesting, but still where I see many limits, which is the project of problem-based learning, which is focused on solutions, in which through solutions precipitates the closure through finite answers. This is about developing arousing, evocative, and reflexively stimulating questions. It also has to do with the importance of symbols that Niculescu also talks about in From Modernity to Postmodernity. So the complexity of symbolic thinking also is involved. Thereby, this is about opening up multiple perspectives and multiple attentions at once. Then, artistic and art-based research have many different qualities. I cannot go in details, of course, right now and today. Just in short, when I say, or when some researchers say artistic research, they mean research which is carried out in the context of art. You know what in our modern societies we call art fields or forms of artistic practice. When one says, if I would know where the sender is, it would might help. When we say arts-based research, we mean research that involves artistic elements, artistic qualities within, for example, the social sciences. I mean, I come from social sciences, so I will take in this case the social sciences. So I will talk now a bit more about arts-based research. So this is research involving the systematic uses of artistic processes, the actual making of artistic expressions in all the forms, the different forms of arts, and employing these as a primary way of understanding and examining experience. So that's I'm quoting Sean McNeef, who's been writing on that. In social science, I'm going to change my tactic and not move because I don't like these noises. So, yes. Yeah, the sound is much better, even though the movement is lost. But you will have to follow the movements of my tongue instead, verbal movements. So yes, in social sciences, art-based elements can be involved in all the phases of the research. That means at the phase of data collection, of analysis, interpretation, and representation. It can affect our very ideas on the nature of knowledge and understanding, introducing things that have often been kept out from the breadth of a researcher's access to the world. It especially is very interesting to appeal to arts-based forms of research in order to allow more embodied cognition, paying attention to the importance of the body in movement through kinesthetics, of the senses, learning also from, there's a lot that has been said in phenomenology about this. For example, Merleau-Ponty is definitely very interesting to go deeper into that, of emotions, of intuitions, of the subconscious, of tacit knowing, and mobilizing all of these in forms of artful research and through this question-based learning I mentioned, which also means embodied questions. I won't have time now to go in details, but there is an interesting correlate to this, which is the question of how the imaginary is involved. This is something that Niculescu mentioned in, also from modernity to postmodernity, but where I would also have some arguments, actually, also some things I'm missing in your interpretation of it, where there's many interesting links, especially between sensory perception and the imaginary level, and also the imaginary institution of society. So things where Kant and Merleau-Ponty and also Cornelius Castoriadis can be especially interesting to look at these. But in any case, this role of imagination, imaginaries, is a very important part of in arts-based forms of research. It's also about exploring the spaces between what is known and what is not, and also exploring into forms of darkness, allowing ambiguities and ambivalences. These things can be very well worked on through arts-based forms of research. Arts-based research also allows to enhance the awareness of the subjective self, the researcher recognizing herself or himself as an author, as a storyteller, taking responsibility for the imagination, for one's imagination, and reflecting on the imagination, not just reflecting mindfully, but reflecting intuitively and reflecting corporeally. So this is about developing imaginative investigations that articulate constellations of possible meanings, allow a large freedom of lateral and associated thinking, and working with lived experience. lived experiences. We also just heard in terms of several education projects just now, where one also sees those artful forms of learning. Empirically, this means developing a heightened awareness of the multiple levels and processes of interpretation that are at play in perception and in further cognitive and intersubjective communicative processes, finding ways to express knowledge that cannot be expressed merely by denotative writings, and focusing on contextual knowledge, including the audience, the recipients, and their interpretative works in the knowledge production process. To come back to Niculescu and in Modernity to Postmodernity, he's very well describing that in much detail in the case of the theater of Peter Brook and the relationship with the audience through that theatrical work. Then, however, not however, and it's just what's also interesting in this is to see this artistic process as a kind of life art, what I would like to call a queer life art and also a convivialist life art. Here I'm seeing art as a verb, so not so much art as a thing, but art as a kind of transformative force in society, a source of complex questionings that sharpens our ability to engage through transdisciplinarity with the world's compounding challenges. So art as a verb, not art as a noun. Art conceiving being as becoming. This is also, to name another person, Tim Ingold is very interesting in his views on being alive and the process of becoming. Becoming transdisciplinary is also to break out of the cis-cultural into the transcultural, as we heard before, the inter and the transcultural, out of the cisgender, the cis-racialized, the cis-normative attitudes to becoming human. This encourages a complex experience of the world where harmony through contradictions and tensions through apparent harmony are embraced with and are played with. And I think this playful living of life is also a queering of good life. Not about preserving good life. The search for sustainability should, and for sustainable development, some people prefer, should be interpreted as inviting us to experiment and to experience other lives, to open up to future-oriented questions and queer those other potentially good lives, taking resilience as the moving horizon. I don't have time to discuss resilience, but resilience implies redundancy. Many options of possible lives, and not just one good life, not one blueprint of utopia or good life. We also need to question any lazy concepts relating to the question of cultural identity, engage in intercultural and transculturally rich and experiences, opening up to indeterminacy in our everyday lives, learning through serendipitous life experiences. Here the three princes of serendip are also very important symbol, story. It's also about overcoming the pitfalls of an identitarian trinity. The identitarian trinity of speciesism, communitarianism, and individualism. Resilience implies an ability to learn from and to absorb disturbances, to be changed, to reorganize, and especially to co-evolve with the world, while developing an ethical, societal direction, one example of which can be found sketched very interestingly in a collective text, the Convivialist Manifesto, around the principles of interdependency and care. A queering life art does not seek or bring certainties, comfort, and clear borders. Instead, it fosters uncertainties that stimulate denormalizing and denaturalizing aesthetic experience and thought processes and embodiment processes. It is a process, one could say, that's where, when one thinks of theater, I would choose not to think of a distanciation of Brecht, which is very intellectualized in a way, but rather to think of this idea of a hot distanciation, not a cold distanciation, but a hot distanciation, and the idea of freaky desires that one finds in one queer theorist and queer artist, Renate Lorenz, and also actually the writings of the son. keeping you in a warm flux of intellectual, emotional, and corporeal confusion, which is an artful state that can help to keep certain ambiguities and ambivalences, to work with them, to let them thrive in certain moments in their lives in order to learn from them and to experiment. From such experiences can arise more interesting queerings of good lives, taking us to other possible desires, elsewhere than within the vast dependencies of an affluent consumerism. Besides, a vigilant and a chronic process of queering is also necessary to ward off a rigidification of ethics into some kind of moralism. So we need a constant reflexive work of denormalization and deterritorialization of identities, without which this genetic potential of chaos that Morin also talked about in, I forgot, somewhere in the message, thousands of pages there. So this kind of genetic potential of chaos, it would be choked off without this form of process and of work. So we need to mobilize aesthetic sensitivities to a living complexity with this kind of convivialist direction I was mentioning, but also I would challenge you to consider with Discordian eroticism. I won't go into their details, but this involves queering gender, which is actually where queer theory is coming from after all, queering sexualities, queering more generally our different forms of personal embodied lives, the lives of our mind bodies. And one example, one slightly provocative, because it used to be considered extremely, it's still nowadays very taboo. One example is the practices of BDSM, bondage, domination, and sadomasochism, which there's a lot of cliches about them, but those embodied practices are an amazing source of everyday lived experience of the I cannot speak Latin properly, the coincidentia oppositorium of this antagonisms, and finding other levels in ways which are very, very, so to say, deeply felt, which have to do with, I will just take two false binaries, or two binaries, which are very simple, which we all know, pain and pleasure, and domination and submission, which are the basis of this kind of embodied practice, and where these kind of practices can bring us way further, way far away from those cliches of pain and pleasure, or those cliches of what is power, and where is domination or submission. So this brings then to, and I will just have, how many minutes? 5 minutes? Okay. Six, okay. Then to this question of doing, of transdisciplinary doing through artful practices. And this is where the idea is to look into, that's what I'm doing also as my social research actually for the last couple of years, looking into societal spaces of possibility, spaces which are in everyday societal life, and spaces which are in public life. So it's about doing transdisciplinarity together, where we live, where we work, in our everyday social environments. And this is about spaces of possibilities, meaning physical spaces, physical geographical spaces, social spaces, spaces of the social, and mental spaces. Spaces where potentially sustainable futures are already taking some shape now in society, in our lives, are emerging and can be experienced by those who participate in it. Another word for this, which had been discussed a few years ago, and is still discussed by an American sociologist, Eric Olin Wright, is the idea of real utopias. So utopias which are current experiments in our societies, in our cities, in our villages, which allow to develop desirability, but also viability and achievability. There's different qualities of space of possibility. I won't again have time to go in details, but those in short that I would like to mention are imagination, experimentation, challenging experience, creative, social creativity, participatory learning, and prefigurative doing. So very shortly, imagination, here I mean pointing to how spaces of possibility allow participants in those experiments in the city, allowing them the unfolding of imagination, ideally a critical and radical imagination about what desirable futures do they have, do they develop, or do we develop rather, and not they, Experimentation, this is not in the sense of a controlled science lab experiment here, but this is in the sense of an artistic experimentation, an artful experimentation of a desirable and a viable everyday life, which can be conducted, in this case, I mean, not just by a single, specific, specialized, I mean, a profession or a group of people we call artists. I mean, really here, in communities. This is something that we will hear, and we are very happy we will hear in the case of Olivier later an example exactly of how this can be done with communities, because I'm just not talking in Czech always without an example. This also has to do with challenging experiences, not just comfortable experiences, but challenging experiences that relate to various areas and issues in relation to everyday life. And also the idea that creativity is not just the creativity of one person, but a social creativity, a group creativity shared and allowing participative learning. And finally, the idea of prefigurative learning is a kind of Gestaltung, a kind of creative activity of giving form and shape while doing or making something which prefigures what could be, what a future society could be, even though, of course, one cannot just, it's not about revolution, it's about creating those prefigurative spaces. I won't have time for that, but other interesting parallels have with the question of heterotopia, creating a different space and a different time in spaces of possibility for in everyday life, which is still separate from everyday life, while at the same time not a full heterotopia, because those spaces are part of archipelagos. They are connected in networks to many other spaces and possibilities in contemporary societies. Yes, and then to conclude, maybe one thing is that, Hans Tiedemann, my colleague Hans Tiedemann, was writing recently that transdisciplinary learning and knowing, when it moves in between levels of reality, allows us to see unity and connectedness as a capacity we create inside of us. So this links, of course, to the included third. We heard about hidden third, and I won't go into. We talked a lot about that today. Realizing unity in knowing, surpassing the fragmentation of knowledge. However, I'd like to stress that such unity and connectedness must always explicitly be seen as a plurality within qualitative complexity, without tipping into any form of holistic simplification. Artful sustainability is convivial and discordian. This is why a crucial quality of artistic and art-based approaches is to maintain tensions, to maintain discomfort, irritations, and challenging experiences while moving in between and across levels of reality, and also to associate ontological, epistemological, and political imaginations. Thank you.
Thank you, Sacha, for this bright and deep talk, which is very stimulating and certainly will work in our heads and souls for a long time. Still, thank you very much. So, because you are a little bit tired, we'll make an exception to the program in order to give you a little bit more delay for break. So, because I see eyes which are a little bit. So, we begin with 15 minutes difference. You come back at 5:15. Okay? Relax, go around, there are very nice places here, move like he moved at the beginning. Okay, discuss between you, eliminate the sleep, and come back because we'll have very important other things to discuss.